Professor Frank Furedi, author, sociologist, a man with his finger very much on the pulse of the nation. Frank, a very good morning to you. Greetings of the season. I suppose I can now say, because it is Christmas week, greetings of the season, because it doesn't feel that Christmassy because everything's going to be disrupted. But how are you?
I'm well, and are we allowed to say Merry Christmas?
Certainly. You certainly can say Merry Christmas. The only reason
Merry Christmas.
The only reason I haven't said it yet is that I don't feel very Christmassy, but you help yourself, you know, as apart from anything else, it's unusual to say it the day after the World Cup final.
I know, that was a remarkable World Cup final. It didn't feel right in some ways until the very last match. But
yes.
The final game was just fantastic and quite memorable.
It really was, and famously, of course, ruined by somebody called Gary. You know, Gary Lineker stopped everybody at the beginning of it to make sure that they listened to his diatribe about human rights, and then he sort of behaved himself for the rest of it. And then Gary Neville picked up the gauntlet like a sort of pound shop version of the Match of the Day host and went off on some mad rant yesterday.
I know. Well, anyway, I've learned over the years not to trust anybody called Gary. There are a few honorable exceptions, but certainly these two guys demonstrate that there's a problem there. And I think what's really worrying to me is that there are people who are determined to politicize football as they are determined to politicize every single sport.
Yes.
So we have the Garys on this side of the pond. On the other side of the pond, you have newspapers like the Washington Post basically criticizing the Argentinian team for being too white.
Yes, brilliant.
As if somehow that was like a cultural sin. They would never actually argue that the team from Ghana or Nigeria or Senegal was too black. But for some reason, it's in their head that they have to racialize every single event, you know, whether it's football or the theater or just about anything.
Yes.
And I was a little bit disappointed that when you have all these mean-spirited commentators using football in that kind of a way, it does distract from the pleasure and the joy of watching a really great football match.
Exactly right. But of course the Washington Post, like many media organisations now, is not the behemoth that it used to be in the days of Woodward and Bernstein. It's now been taken over, I think, by Jeff Bezos, hasn't it? Yeah,
I mean, if you read the Washington Post, you don't need to have a PhD in journalism to know what the article is going to be about. It's so predictable. The moans and the groans and the whining that they've turned into an art form, along with the New York Times, indicates that there's this real impulse to somehow turn every single joyous, positive experience into a problem. And it's almost like they're looking for problems to solve, even problems that don't exist. That's American journalism for you in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable how American journalism has deteriorated, isn't it? I mean, it really is awful. I see it from time to time, obviously online, but when I was there as well, I mean, the newspapers, I used to pick up a copy of the New York Times in the morning and just think, well, I'll just go, there'll be something in here that I can find to read, which is of some use. There's literally nothing in the New York Times at all worth a fag end.
I know, and I used to read the New York Times every day. I loved reading it. But now when you read the New York Times, they've got these specializations, so they really have it in for Britain. And every time the word Britain is mentioned, it's kind of mentioned as a kind of dead-end country that's more or less finished, that's in decline, that is continually got all kinds of problems. You know, government failure, cultural failure. British people have every single sort of disease that you can imagine, from being homophobic to being patriotic to being racist.
Yeah.
They have this kind of fantasy of Britishness. It's almost as if it was invented by Walt Disney.
Right.
Where this is like the horror show. This is, you come to Britain and you expect to be either in purgatory or in hell.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, when I started going to America in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, you would run into people who would ask you questions like, is it really foggy in London? And I was used to tell them it was. Yeah, absolutely. You can't see across the street. It's an absolute nightmare. This is sort of the new version of that, you know. It's the sort of post-Netflix view of Americans who have never been out of the country, who go, oh, yeah, it must be terrible there. And it's the same thing, isn't it? It's just ignorance.
It's ignorance. And I think what's even worse is they got this belief that we're really badly off. I'm not saying that we're flourishing and thriving, but we're not that badly off. But when you look at our problems, and you compare it to the United States, if you kind of contrast New York to London, you'll find out that London is an entirely different league. We haven't got garbage thrown all over the streets. We haven't got the high levels of crime that afflicts New York. And just in general, when you walk around Manhattan these days, it feels dirty and grimy in the way that it wasn't in the past. And,
yes. No, I've not been back to Manhattan since COVID because I fear that I will hate it so much that I'll never return. Because I used to love living there. I used to love the vibe of the place, and they killed it off. Successive kind of Democrat mayors who just turned it into an absolute kind of pile of dung, really. And I'm not really very interested in going.
It's a tragedy because as a very young man, I used to love hanging out in Manhattan. And there was that kind of sense of possibilities and freedom.
Yeah.
That you associate with America, that pioneering spirit, and that's just gone. Instead, what you have is essentially this very woke, culture warish kind of culture. You go into a museum, and every picture that you look at has got a warning sign on it telling you that this painter was, bad to his children in 1843, or this painting was painted by a man whose second grandfather was a racist.
Yeah.
There's almost like a compulsion to criticize everything that is beautiful in museums.
Well, I mean, it became this peak thing, didn't it, with Gary Neville last night, because there is no perspective anymore, particularly from the wokists, so if you start criticising Qatar because their workers' rights are not great, he starts equating it with Britain. And you go, sorry? There's a piece of video which is hilarious. I would urge you to go and find it, that Gary Neville put out, where before he went to Qatar for the World Cup, he goes out on a sort of mission and describes the... and he's obviously doing it for a podcast or a vodcast of some kind. He's describing the beautiful new stadiums as breathtaking and amazing. And then he gets some guy on, who I think is the head of the Qatar World Cup committee, and he puts it to him that there are lots of people who say who are said to have died. And the guy goes, no, that's all lies, it's all rubbish, it's not true, there's only 3. And that's the end of the interview. It's not like he presses him, he doesn't say anything else. So this is his version of kind of, giving air and airtime to something that he doesn't agree with. But it's pathetic, it really is. And to say that because somehow this government is denying a pay rise to nurses and train drivers is the same, it's incredible.
Yeah, I think what Gary is doing is try to get maximum publicity for himself.
Yeah.
He's been doing that for a while, and he's continually making off-the-cuff comments about all kinds of things, just as a way of projecting himself into the public domain. I think he wants to somehow trump the other Gary and kind of gain a degree of authority.
Yeah.
This highly intellectual, politically sus, socially concerned football commentator.
Yeah, and that's, in the end, that's all he is.